welcome to this Let's Chat About Inclusive Education session. In these chats, our purpose is to introduce you to individuals who are working to make Canadian schools inclusive. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm joined today by my two colleagues, Diane Richler, who's chair of the Catalyst for Inclusive Education, an initiative of Inclusion International. And Diane's a former executive vice president of Inclusion Canada. And by Jackie Speck. Jackie's a professor of education at Western University in London, Ontario, and the director of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education. Our guest today is Tanya Whitney, a New Brunswick educator with a range of experience that we'll explore during this session. She's been a teacher in a First Nations school, a resource teacher, a principal, a vice principal, director of education in school districts. And she worked for a period of time implementing inclusive education on a provincial level in New Brunswick schools, following the Strengthening Inclusion, Strengthening Schools report. So we welcome Tanya here today, and we'll start, Tanya, by just asking you, how is it that you have devoted a significant part of your career to making our schools inclusive? How did that come about?
Well, thinking back on how this has come about, I feel that it was certainly a value set in the way I grew up to understand that anything around social justice and community building was really important. So it was a value that was really confirmed a lot in the community that I was raised in, definitely in my own family. And I began my career in a First Nations school, worked there for 8 years. And I didn't even know at the time that there was probably more of a formal notion of, that we would call inclusive education. But my eyes certainly became open, probably more in terms of equity issues through the lens of equity and accessibility to the same supports, like in the First Nations school I was working in, the Indigenous school, compared to even the public system. And then also having a lot of students that were really struggling. And so I certainly cared, and I was struggling and trying to figure out how to best support these kids. At the same time, the narrative in our province was around integration and then inclusion, and I wasn't necessarily aware of that on a formal front. And then I started working in the public system, and this is a really great question, because really the first time that I really understood that there was a whole body of work to help name and articulate this dedication to inclusive ed around social justice and human rights specifically was when I went to an institute in PEI, probably in the early 2000s or late 90s. That I know you were there, Gordon, and we were able to put a name to it, like for me, for new educators like me, and to say there's a whole body of work and there's a whole movement around inclusive ed. And really that was the beginning, and that lit a fire under me, and it also gave me strength. So then I worked in different schools in different capacities, but I was able to then draw on that, again, that whole breadth of work that there'd been significant work in inclusive ed, and got to sort of draw on that in the different contexts that I was in.
Why did you go to the Institute in PEI, do you think? Did your supervisor suggest it, or you heard about it? What drew you there?
Well, yeah, and thinking back just about how things happen, right? We were the largest school district at the time. It was St. John. And I remember clearly our director saying, finishing our principals meeting saying, oh, by the way, I got this brochure. They have this brochure. There's this institute. It's around inclusive ed. If anyone's interested, give me your name and we'll draw people out of the hat. And she just explained a little bit what it was. And I was like, that I think resonates. That is so cool. I'm going to put my name in. I am not going to get drawn, thinking this is it'll be so competitive. And I don't know whether other people were drawn to it like I was, but I went, and it was just enlightening to go. So yeah, it was just presented. That isn't that interesting though, and how systems change, right? And how we introduce information, right? And how we learn, and how intentional are we, or how haphazard things are. But at that time, it was sort of like, oh, by the way, there's this thing. If people want to sign up, go for it.
Well, one of the lessons I learned from Gordon is about taking advantage of opportunities. And a lot of people see those opportunities go by and think, well, not for me, not now, can't do it. But clearly that had a huge impact. And Gordon, clearly you wrote the brochure very well.
Yeah, was that the conference that I think it followed the McKay report?
I think, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So you've been part of inclusion in New Brunswick schools for 20 years or so in public education. It gets a lot of positive press globally in Canada and beyond, but it also gets a lot of criticism here at home. What's your take on that? Like, are both true? Is one true and not the other? Like, is it wonderful? Is it great but has challenges? How do you kind of sort that out?
Yeah, it's an interesting context here in New Brunswick, and I would say it's not wonderful. In terms of our real embracing and understanding, it's our heritage. We're pioneers on some level. And again, part of my career, I've done school review. So I've been in dozens and dozens of schools across this province and reviewed them. In some ways, there's this pervasive practice of inclusive ed that we just take for granted in New Brunswick. And so there certainly is this understanding, dedication on a universal level, I think, in all of our schools. But there's also always this tension, this undercurrent of misunderstanding really what inclusion is. And I think in a frustrated system, which I think a lot of our jurisdictions are across the globe, but definitely in New Brunswick, in a frustrated system that's frustrated for a lot of different reasons, not happy about all sorts of conditions in our system, inclusion is the one that people go to. And it becomes a bit of a scapegoat, and it becomes the catch-all for all of our concerns. Like, well, we don't have enough staff is because of inclusion. We have kids that are out of control. Inclusion isn't working. And I've always found that if you start digging into it, people will go, no, yeah, we get that kids need to be here. Like they sort of get it, but yet there's these niggly things that we don't talk enough about. Like and I think in the absence of talking through really why is it that we care and commit to inclusion, and what does it really, really look like, it becomes a very easy target. And in New Brunswick, it can become a sore spot. We have a lot of great practices, a lot of great schools, a lot of teachers that don't even know what they're doing is inclusion. But man, it continues to be a bit of a sore spot at times.
I'm wondering, how do we change that, right? I mean, it was interesting, Tanya, you were talking about your first foray was into this conference that you were invited, this institute, and that being surprised, perhaps, that there was this whole body of research that says inclusion works, and here's why it works, and here's how it works, and here's why we ought to do it. And I just find, similar to what you're saying, I find this across the country and around the globe, that there's still people that say, but it doesn't work. And so it's that sort of practice theory gap, if you like. Any ideas? I mean, you've been involved in the system for a long time. You were a teacher, you've been a principal. How do we do better? I mean, where you've seen it work, how does that happen? What does that look like?
And we know this is a complex mandate to always keep at the forefront. I don't want to simplify, but in thinking about this, I can't, one of the biggest, there's two things, and in New Brunswick, we have this first one. When we create policy standards and have a very formal, North Star of what we should be doing in a system, that's critical. It's like you can't move forward without that. We have that here. But the second piece is leadership. The second piece is having system leaders understand the why, and not just the why of inclusion, because I think we have some amazing leaders across this province that buy into inclusive ed. They don't understand the need to maintain this learning orientation around inclusion. So that so we do policy development well, often, but policy implementation, which is the ongoing cycle of learning and not taking anything for granted about any of the things that are important in an education system, and certainly inclusion. If they don't understand that, then it doesn't take very long for that memory and that corporate memory about why do we do what we do to just sort of fade away. So if leaders don't think that they have a role in carrying this, and my experience is often leadership doesn't think that they have that role, they think it's all frontline, then that is where, when we work with that level, that I think we start to see more traction. And because in the absence of it, then people are like, they can't quite understand, why would we go through this?
Right. It's interesting, right? Because I've seen now Stephen Katz out of Toronto. He talks about, the ABC, right? The acronym, the binder, and the cash. And that's typically how we implement policy in our ministries. And so, you get the cute little name, and then you got money for 3 years, and then we're done. So, we've done inclusion. We've already been there, and now we're moving on to something else. And I wonder if that's not part of the headache of education, in that people think, oh, here's another thing. Here's another thing. Here, it's a fad, instead of it, as you say, taking on that understanding that there's a commitment to this, and we're there, all the time and constantly, not just for 3 years.
Yeah, it's not an add-on. It's how we frame our schools. It's the very foundation, right? And that you're absolutely right. And it's like a lot of educational initiatives. So as long as it's treated that way, as a new package, and then and again, it's frontline people are passionate often about this, but if leadership can't keep us remembering this, then I talk to all sorts of people who don't even remember that there's a policy 322 right now, right? And you got to remind them, right? And if you go back to that, that'll give you grounds for asking for more supports. And you just got to keep it at the forefront. I think leadership's a big piece. Adequate staffing, but we have that conversation in New Brunswick, and I have to say I'm a little fatigued of that conversation. I think we have fantastic staffing in our province in terms of resource teachers and support staff. And we have an ISD model that we have wraparound support. So we have lots of discrete supports in this province that we've asked for.
What's ISD?
The integrated service delivery model, which is, I'm sure other jurisdictions have it, but we've fought for that for a long time here. And it's certainly on the ground where every school has access to, health, mental health, social development. So, we can literally reach out from the school now and get a social worker for a student. But in the absence of understanding that that's couched in an inclusive model where our end goal is that every child has this common experience, universal experience together with other children, then even that structure that we would fight for in an inclusive school cannot maybe meet our ends of inclusive schools if we still treat kids often on a medical model. So anyhow, I don't think I don't buy the staffing one as a stumbling block, not in our province. I think, or resources. I think it's a matter of keeping our vision and why we do it really, really clear.
So some of your previous jobs, you've gone to a number of different schools, as you said. And I know in the, was it 2011, 2012, you were part of the province-wide visitation to look at inclusive practice specifically. So when it comes to what separates a school that's successful and doing well from those that are really, really struggling, what do you think the critical elements are?
So besides a dedication from leadership, I would say, Gordon, that schools that have a very healthy collaborative ESS model,
Okay,
Yeah.
You have to explain the acronyms.
Yeah. So schools,
ESS.
yeah, which we call here educational support services. So schools have strong teams, and particularly around how they support students, have way better coordination ability and in a school. And I find that those schools, again, any school can fall into a medical model where they're just supporting kids as individuals and pulling them out and all that stuff. But an ESS or a teams that supports, wrap around within a school and work with administration, work with teachers, very collaborative. I find that's a good indicator of a school that understands the collaboration, and the wraparound is really, really important. The practice, the sort of the high level practice of a really great inclusive school is if you can really integrate. So there's a lot of co-teaching going on between your specialist teachers, the support teachers like your resource teachers, and even guidance and any type of specialist in the bigger schools, and you're working alongside teachers. And you're looking at your children as a whole cohort, and how do we do our best to keep children in common settings and maybe give them some specialized things about what they need. But when teachers collaborate and talk a lot about how to do that together, I think that's an indicator of a school. Also, parent involvement. It's a piece I wanted to share. Parent engagement, and I've been spending the last 3 or 4 years really digging into that more. Successful schools care enough about engaging those families.
Engaging how?
Well, in the problem solving, as if they actually have knowledge to give, which I say that with, because it's such a concern that we don't often honor the knowledge and the expertise that families have. And so then what we do, well, we just sort of dismiss it, and it's not helpful. It's also not helpful for us. And then it becomes one more weight and stumbling block and frustration that families that support children who have whatever needs, intellectual disability or whatever, that they just get so frustrated and with us and think we don't honor them, and they don't think that we're really partners.
So what advice would you have for parents who are up against an administration that doesn't want to listen to them?
Well, number one, to do their best to be informed about what that jurisdiction's policies are, so that they can go in with knowledge and say, I do deserve to be at the table, and I do deserve a meeting. And I do understand some of the supports. The other thing is to look for other advocates, even within the school. Like if administrators aren't the be all and end all, and you find maybe the specialist teachers or the resource type teachers that you can go to, or go to teachers. And I encourage families all the time to use outside agencies, which is sort of really sad, right? Mm-hmm. That we would have to even do that to help them penetrate the walls of schools. But yeah, find any advocate. And it's a shame because the families are fatigued and frustrated, and they need allies in schools to just help do that heavy lifting. And they often give up. I can understand why.
One of the things that really fascinated me trying to understand some of the work that you've done is that a lot of it on the surface isn't necessarily related to disability. I'm thinking of your work around sexual violence. I'm thinking about, the work that you talked about a little bit around Indigenous issues. And I guess one of the things that I see often is that when people are focused on including kids with disabilities, they focus only on the disability issue, and they don't think about the fact that children have multiple identities and multiple experiences. I'm wondering if you could just reflect on that a little bit, about how some of your work that's not disability inclusion related helps to inform and to strengthen an inclusive system.
I do agree that I feel that there's a great importance about about intersectionality, right, in all of our experiences, and definitely those for marginalized populations, that we have to understand the complexity, and again, and understand that often there can be multiple disadvantage situations that are occurring for a family or an individual. And I just think it broadens our understanding of holistic support. And so, and again, it takes us away from this siloed way that we deal with problems and deal with schools and deal with children to a more integrated model. I mean, we can't talk about, there's ability and disability. There's equity issues such as poverty and those who have privilege and again, gender issues and all sorts of things. Like, to me, equity is a full pillar that we need to address when we're thinking about inclusive schools. And again, they all go together. They just, they're all pieces. And I think we don't need to be experts in them all, but if we understand that there is this intersectionality of so many different pieces at play, then we're better to support whole families and whole children and whole schools. And we can't be perfect, but we get so isolated and siloed when we start to just dissect everything. And so that work is important to me. I mean, I'm just curious about all of this work, and I know it all plays together in how we create whole, healthy communities.
And where do you draw your support from?
That's a great question. I have a very helpful, strong, reliable community, again, just in my own circle, in my own family, and my own friends. I know an awful lot of people. I know where to go, but I have a very small circle. And I'm also just an optimist. So, and I'm a realist and an optimist. So I look at things, and when things aren't going my way or things aren't going well for me, or there's just so many negative, you're thinking there's a barrier and we're not getting here and we've gone backwards. I'm so far-sighted and such an optimist that I believe that often we just have to endure some of these blips and then I'll come back around. So part of it's just maybe my genetics. I'm just born very optimistic.
I mean, you've worked in, you're from Nackawic, you grew up in that area, but you've worked in other centers in New Brunswick. Do you think that there's a difference in the openness to inclusion in smaller communities where, everybody knows each other as opposed to in the bigger cities? And I asked that question living in Toronto, where I think the lack of community is a huge challenge. But what's your reflection in a province the size of New Brunswick?
Yeah, no, I would see that even here in versus the smaller cities. Even we have small cities, but versus rural, that proximity really makes a difference. And I think that's how we grow. When we're together, we start to realize that even though we're different, we're okay. And so the smaller the school is, the smaller the community, we're all here together. We got to figure it out, be good together. The bigger the schools are, the harder that is to deal with, for sure. And I think there's lots of research around that talks about how can we maintain smaller communities. And I think part of it is just this whole social proximity. If the closer we are, the more we know each other, the more we're apt to be forgiving of otherness. Now, there are other things that we might see in rural communities, such as long held value sets that might be very conservative or conventional around other, and I think mainly of other ethnicities, etc. But you got to then dig in and find ways to have those conversations in a rural community. If they don't have exposure, right, it's hard that would be the issue I would see in a more rural community, is the issue around equity and understanding different lifestyles and different ethnicities, for sure.
So, I mean, you and Gordon for sure have been involved in the inclusive development in New Brunswick for a long time. One of the things that struck me is that I've met adults now who are, working somewhere related to the rights of persons with disabilities, who grew up in inclusiveness and who actually have friends that they went to school with. How much are you seeing that? Can you tell any stories or think of any examples of how the experience that inclusion has had, not just on the kids with disabilities, but on their classmates?
I know the typical place you see it, and again, I have adult children now, is when, you know, they've gone through an inclusive system and they are seeing their friends, I guess, or kids they've gone to school with who are in the workplace, right? And sometimes they're friends with them on Facebook, right? I think that piece is where, again, there's a benefit, right? That we have sort of laid the groundwork that these children, especially with intellectual and physical disabilities, have been in schools. Kids are just used to them being there. Then when they are transitioning to even like the McDonald's or Value Village or somewhere like that, a lot of them work at stores or places. Our kids know them. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think there's richer community experiences that we could benefit from, but we certainly are seeing a lot more visibility of people with intellectual disabilities in workplaces. And my 20-some-year-old kids are certainly, they know who they are. They tell me who they are.
I think so many parents of sons and daughters with intellectual disabilities, the idea that their sons and daughters could have even Facebook friends who don't have disabilities, or that they would be so known in the community, would be such an inspiration, and it's, you know, something that they would really hope for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and my sense is that that's a unique experience in New Brunswick because of how many, you know, young adults, and even not so young now, have gone through the experience of being at school with people with disabilities.
So, Tanya, you're back in a school, not a huge school, it's a fairly small school compared to the last school you were principal of in St. John. What do you find returning to a school and working there 7-8 hours a day, every day, week in, week out? What can you reflect on that you've, when you think about inclusion and how it's working?
Well, I was really interested in going back, and sort of after many travels in my career, going back to a school where I had the full experience. I don't have a vice principal. I teach quite a bit, and being very much in contact, being the person in contact with the families, with the children, and with the staff. And this is where I have my information that I feel there's this pervasive dedication in all of our schools for inclusive ed. Our teachers they couldn't name it even with me. They maybe don't even know my experience, some of them, but they couldn't name it, but they take care of kids. It's whole kids, and they want their kids in their class. What I've seen is that we have a massive disconnect, which just happens in systems, between teaching and what teachers are doing and what principals are doing, and this whole other world that we have set up of student service supports. It's like never the two shall meet. Like, I'm an informed person and I'm not even sure how to access some of that world in my own district. It's become so, it's so big and it's so separate. It's siloed. And so that's here we are 20 years later, that I think we have created a resource-rich system around supporting students. And yet the reality in a school is what I saw from my teachers and even myself, it's not integrated into necessarily the everyday of what we do in classrooms, that's discouraging.
So what has to change?
First, I think we need to dismantle this silo of student services and how it even operates at that middle management level. It's just the way it works at our province, but definitely at districts, that you have directors of schools and directors of education. And then you have over here, directors of student supports. And again, there's maybe not a structural reason why they have to work together. So when directors of schools are responsible for everything that happens with the principals and the teachers, but yet this other whole arm's responsible for what happens to the children with identified learning needs, then that's just going to set up chaos. So, and no communication. So, I mean, I'd like to see way more integrated directorships at middle management level, that then you have your immediate supervisor is talking to you about all things. They're talking to you about inclusion. They're talking to you about student supports. They're talking to you about managing your staff. And instead of siloed middle management that you, yeah, because my go-to person is a director of schools, and they don't ever talk to me about inclusive ed or how to support kids. You know, they say, well, if you've got an issue, you go somewhere else. So I think that integration and a system level helps schools.
We're almost out of time. Jackie, you have a final thought or a question for Tanya?
Yeah, I just think, you know, you've talked about how it all comes back to leadership. And so, you know, maybe coming back to even some of the stuff Diane asked about, how, you know, what do you tell parents if things aren't going well with the school? I wonder, you know, what do you tell leaders if things aren't going well with the school?
Well, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if you're, I don't know if you're asking that literally or, so I don't want to make it seem like I'm pointing the finger somewhere else, but it even at a school level, it begins with the school principal. And if you're not going to frame things from an inclusive perspective, you're not going to put that lens, you're not going to talk about that with your staff, if no one else, if your people around you, your supervisors aren't doing it either. And again, I think people care. You know, it's just that they don't, it's not a focus. If they're not hearing anyone talk about it, then, you know, we need to talk about things a lot more. We need to talk about inclusive ed, and we need to keep it on the front burner at all times, just like we talk about literacy or school safety. You know, we need to talk about inclusive schools all the time.
Okay, well, we're glad you joined us to do just that in this session. I want to tell people that if you want to read about what Tanya's shared about one of her experiences in a school and some transformation towards inclusion, you can go to the Inclusive Education Canada website, and there's a publication there called The Journey to Inclusive Schooling, a Guide. It was published in 2020, and there are 5 or 6 cases that underpin the generalizations in the document. And Tanya's story is one of them. So if you go to the end of the document, you'll find some really illuminating detail about leadership and process that she shared with us, and you can find it there. So thank you so much, Tanya. It's good to see you again. And I'm sure you're going to make a big difference in your home middle school. And we appreciate you taking time during your vacation week to share time with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.